Yeah, guten Morgen. Thank you very much for this introduction. Thank you very much for having me here. So the chair built such a nice bridge for my contribution that I do not have to say what I wanted to say, namely now for something completely different. For me, as a classicist and philosopher, it's very exciting to be finally able to address real Naturforscher. I have to warn you, though, that all the theories I'm going to present are either obsolete or obviously obsolete. Still, I think that most of these old folks I'm dealing with are in a way scientifically minded. So take, for example, Epicurus. Epicurus is convinced that all our human anxieties come from pre-scientific beliefs that we acquired. And so he took pains and get out of his way to account for all virtually puzzling natural phenomena in terms of what he took to be the leading physical theory, the physics of atomism. He wrote 37 books addressing many natural phenomena that could threaten our peace of mind if remained unexplained. Or take, for example, Aristotle, so a founding figure of zoology and hence of biology in general. Aristotle, when he approached his biological project, started by writing his largest book, which just consists in a collection of facts. So we heard yesterday about data collection. And Aristotle has this clear division of labor between first collecting the facts and then trying to give explanations. Also, with regard to our question today, origin and definition of life, I think I will be able to show that these old folks are puzzled by the same sort of questions that we are puzzled by, and also that on a conceptual level, they reach at some conclusions that are not that far from what we take to be the state of the art. So, looking for a reliable source for the question of what life is, I found this entry at a homepage of the Max Planck Society, this synthetical biology group. And what they're saying here is essentially this: life is a matter of definition. What is life? This is a long-standing core question of biology, the science that deals with living beings. Yet, to this day, the phenomenon of life remains enormously complex and difficult to grasp. Depending on the perspective and scientific discipline, whether biologists, chemists, physicists, or philosophers, there are many different attempts to approach a comprehensive definition of life. However, researchers have not yet found an all-encompassing definition. Now, they are appealing to competing definitions, which is not the same as saying that life is a matter of definition. They appeal to perspectivism from different sciences, and they display a mild skepticism about the possibility of a comprehensive definition. So they say it's, however, important to recognize the typical characteristics of life, and then they give, indeed, a list of such characteristics, namely 1, compartments, limited or surrounded, for example, by a membrane. There are programs, information media, genetic blueprints that can be stored and transmitted. There's metabolism, the continuous exchange with environment for the sake of self-preservation and reproduction. There are thermodynamic systems. There's catalysis, chemical energy-consuming reactions. There's regulation, so living beings are homeostatic systems. There's growth, and there's reproduction, i.e. the transformation of information. And there's adaptation and evolution with a survival benefit through adaptation. Now, actually, if we use this very useful tool, Historical Dictionary of Biology by Georg Töpfer, we find that this approach to life, i.e. defining life by this kind of characteristics, has a long history. If we read through this page, which is not readable on the slides, you will find in addition to the characteristics already mentioned, sorry, it was too quick, organization, order, self-movement, nourishment, metabolism, self-preservation, regulation, functional interaction with environment, thank you, reproduction, growth, endogenetic development, life, death, variation, heredity, mutagenicity, perception, responsiveness to stimuli from outside, and performance of species-specific functions. Good. Now, this is my thesis today. This idea of defining life by checklists does have ancient predecessors. This is Aristotle, and in his work On the Soul, De Anima, we find this quote. What is animate seems to differ from what is not animate, chiefly in two respects, motion and perception. These are also very nearly the two features which we have taken over from our predecessors. So this is interesting here because it's a summary of what his predecessors have achieved with regard to life. They say life is different by motion and perception. And then when he gives his own account, he says, living is spoken of in several ways. And should even one of these belong to something, we say that it is alive. Reason, perception, motion and rest with respect to place, and further the motion in relation to nourishment, decay, and growth. And look, that's very nice. He just subdivides perception into reason and as a higher kind of perception, or higher kind of cognition and perception, and he subdivides motion into locomotion, and so bodily changes that go on in our body with an effect to decay and growth. And so this is my thesis today, as announced, namely that even though the ancient Greek philosophers I'm dealing with had no understanding whatsoever of the biochemical processes that are part of our scientific approach to life, they are able to come up with a list of life indicating functions that is very close to the modern lists mentioned above, with the exception of evolution and catalysis. And they answer the question of what life is with reference to this list. Being alive means, for a body, to be able to perform at least one of the life-indicating characteristics, some of which are intrinsically interdependent. And by saying this, I want to take issue with the judgment of the Medavars in their Philosophical Dictionary of Biology, Aristotle to Zeus, who say, the biological works of Aristotle are strange and generally speaking rather tiresome, far ago of hearsay. We do not believe that anyone who decides not to read the works of Aristotle, the biologist, will risk spiritual impoverishment. So, section 1, a little bit of context is perhaps required. So, being alive as being ensouled. In ancient Greek parlance, being alive is often used in a way that is or is almost synonymous with being ensouled, empsychos, or animate. What is ensouled, one could say, does have a soul, even though the transition to the substantive is never as innocent as it may seem. And soul is psyche, or anima. Now, speaking of souls might strike us odd and hopelessly unscientific, since after all, souls might be and have been treated as immortal, as transmigrating from body to body, as the center of moral integrity, or as deeply rooted in religious beliefs. But wait a minute. At least in antiquity, it is not the sheer use of soul that renders a thinker unscientific, but the meaning and the purpose in and for which it is used. Right? So there's a wide spectrum of uses of psyche. On the one end of the spectrum, indeed, we have philosophers who defend the idea that the soul is separable from the body and might even survive the death of the individual body or transmigrate into another, hopefully better, or more handsome body. On the other hand of the spectrum, we find philosophers who, in order to account for what they call the interaction of body and soul, i.e. the effect that our psychic states are deeply rooted in our body, in order to account for the interaction of body and soul, require the soul to be bodily, as for example the atomists, as the already mentioned Epicurus, claim that the soul consists of particularly quick-moving atoms. So what most ancient philosophers can agree on is that it is the soul, in virtue of which living beings think, perceive, love, desire, make decision, so roughly the subject matter of our modern psychology. It's more controversial, though, whether other life-defining functions, such as growth, nourishment, reproduction, should be added to this list. So what I wanted to say is, don't be shocked by the term psyche or soul. Whether it's scientifically treated or not depends on the particular case. Now, I wanted to start with mentioning at least competing cosmogonies, because this seemed to fit very nicely into what we heard yesterday. So most early Greek philosophers of nature, prior to, say, Socrates or Plato, presented speculative cosmogonies, an account of where the world, as we know it, comes from. Often, the origin in the temporal sense is taken to be informative about what our world essentially is. If, for example, everything is said to come from water, it is claimed that the world and its inhabitants ultimately still consist of water. For philosophers identifying the origin with one kind of stuff, the challenge is then to show how the developed world can be explained as a modification or special condition of this one stuff. For those who assume a plurality of original stuffs, like the four elements or the atoms, the challenge is to explain the phenomena of the developed world as mixtures, blends, or aggregations of these original stuffs. And cosmogonies can come in a linear or in a cyclic fashion. So cyclic means that the world is generated and destroyed in turn. Now, here comes the decisive step: cosmogonies and zoogonies, the generation of animals. Most early cosmogonies include speculative depiction of how living beings came to be at a certain stage of the cosmic development. This zoogony is thought to be an intrinsic part of the cosmogony and always aims at a narration about how the first human beings have been generated. This peculiar connection between cosmology and zoogony seems to be particularly promising for our leading question about the origin of life. Sometimes, however, these accounts are pretty underwhelming or strike us as somewhat mythical, even though they are intended as part of a scientific worldview. And what is also typical is that often in this time, cosmogony and zoogony are intertwined. Sometimes it seems that a cosmic origin is even chosen with a view to possible origins of life, water, air, or fire, and that the soul is made of the same sort of stuff that is used to account for the origin of the cosmos. Of Thales, for example, who thought that everything comes from water and consists of water, it is reported, quote, "Perhaps he had derived this assumption that everything is made out of water from seeing that what nourishes all things is moist, and that what is warm itself comes from water, and life lives because of it. It is for this reason, then, that he had this idea, and also from the fact that the seed of all things has a moist nature. Problem? If the origin of the cosmos is the same as the origin of life, what then is distinctive of life, and what makes the difference between lifeless and alive? Question: is this to say that owing to the primordial stuff of the cosmos, the world has always been, as it were, impregnated with life? And I mean, this developmental perspective of cosmogonies also set the stage for certain proto-evolutionist or evolutionary accounts. Anaximander, for example, thought the first living beings came to be from damp evaporating through the impact of the sun. And he also had the idea that human beings must have derived from other animals because it takes a long time for them to develop. So he claims that the first human beings lived in the bodies of fish or similar beings before they went ashore. Anaxagoras had the idea that the first living beings came to be from the moist, the warmth, and the earthy. Later on, they were generated from each other. And Democritus, also an atomist, says that the first human beings derived from the mud, like worms. So under the impact of the sun, first plants and trees developed from the moist earth. In a similar way, certain bubbles were generated, which finally burst, and animals came to the fore. A very funny, allegedly proto-Darwinian account is given by the philosopher Empedocles. So the background is a cyclical process alternating between the total blend of the four elements and the complete separation of them. Accordingly, there are two cosmogonies, including two zoogonies, one while the elements come together in order to form the sphere of love, and one after the sphere of love has been destroyed. Each zoogony consists of two steps. And zoogony number one says, at first there are separate limbs and organs that are generated. For example, arms without shoulders or eyes without forehead. Step two, monsters are generated by incidental combination of the separate limbs, human trunks with the head of a cow and vice versa. And in the second zoogony, there are first asexual, monogeneous, spherical beings, and in step four, plants, animals, human beings with sexual reproduction. Now, let's focus on zoogony number one, step two, the monster beings. Aristotle says on Empedocles, wherever then all the parts came about just what they would have been if they had come to be for an end, such things survived, being organized spontaneously in a fitting way, whereas those which grew otherwise perished and continued to perish, as Empedocles says, his man-faced ox progeny did. Charles Darwin, after quoting the previous passage from Aristotle, says about Aristotle, here we see the principle of natural selection shadowed forth. So did Aristotle invent the survival of the fittest? Problem, Darwin did not quote the addition as Empedocles said, and he was criticized for that. The German translator of Darwin even inserted a footnote explaining to his readers that this refers to Empedocles, not to Aristotle. So did Empedocles invent the survival of the fittest? I don't know, and leave it at that. Back to Aristotle's checklist. Aristotle, as opposed to the philosophers we discussed, offers no cosmogony, as he thinks to have good reasons for assuming that the world has always existed. Accordingly, he does not assume an evolution of life, and he does not himself endorse the survival of the fittest, nor the evolution of species. He does think, though, that there are local variants of one and the same species, and he does acknowledge hybridity, but he does not see a continuous optimizing process. Similarly, Aristotle goes out of his way to describe how different species are adapted to their natural habitat, but he does not speak of the process of adaptation, but rather of the fact of being adapted. So there's no absolute origin of life in time in the Aristotelian framework. What we can inquire into, though, is the transition from the inanimate to the animate, and from lifeless to alive, in the sense of what makes the difference between lifeless and living beings. And we can look into his complex embryology, which accounts for at least the individual beginning of life. So let's get back to this list from where I started. So living is spoken of in several ways. Whenever one of these characteristics is given, we say that something is alive. reason, perception, motion with respect to place, and motion in relation to nourishment, decay, and growth. This gives us the coarse-grained list of life characteristics: reason, perception, higher cognition, common cognition, locomotion, nourishment, metabolism, growth, decay. And there is an order between the items on this list. No living being without nourishment. Without nourishment, no perception. Without rudimentary perception, touch, no higher perception like seeing or hearing. Without perception, no locomotion, and without perception, no higher cognition. Now, let us unpack a bit the faculty of nourishment. What does it mean for a living being to be able to nourish itself? The faculty of nourishment includes food intake, digestion, metabolism. It requires interaction with the environment. Metabolic products are transported to all regions of the body, Aristotle thinks, through the vascular system, which is the precondition for growth and self-preservation. Metabolism works by heat. The bodily heat must be regulated. Breathing plays a role in the course of heat regulation. Decay and death come about through the decreasing capacity of an organism to regulate heat. And the faculty of nourishment also includes the reproductive capacity. So Aristotle thinks that the concoction of nourishment, so digestion always comes with concoction, and the concoction of nourishment results in two kinds of residues: the useless ones, also known as excrements, and the useful ones. Blood, most notably, is such a useful type of residue. By way of further concoction, blood is transformed into the male and to the female type of semen that is required for sexual reproduction. In the course of sexual reproduction, information about species-specific essentials is encoded and stored in so-called movements transmitted from the male to the female semen. So that the faculty of nourishment is both metabolic and informational. And if I go back to the list of the Max Biosyn group and compare that with Aristotle, we see that we have an impressive number of overlap: metabolism, growth, disease, reproduction, regulation, compartments, and up to a point, adaptation. Now, so far, I avoided for Aristotle using the soul vocabulary, thinking that you would be deterred by this kind of parlance. As I said, ancient philosophers are accustomed to frame the differences between lifeless and alive in terms of being ensouled or having a soul. For Aristotle, a body is able to perform one of the above-mentioned characteristics, is said to possess the soul and to be living in virtue of possessing the soul, namely intellectual soul for reasoning, perceptual soul for perception, and a nutritive soul for nourishing and reproductive activities. For Aristotle, the soul is not itself a body, but a condition a natural body is in, namely to be structured or organized in a way such that this body is able to perform the life-defining functions mentioned above. Since there is no life without the functions of the nutritive soul, the transition from lifeless to life is always indicated by one of the functions that are ascribed to the nutritive soul. This is again why for Aristotle, plants do have a soul, the nutritive one. Now let's look very quickly into the transition from inanimate to animate according to the theory of Aristotle. So the three types of soul, intellectual, perceptual, and nutritive, has sometimes used to justify this picture, which is called the scala naturae, life from lifeless, plants, animals, humans, and possibly divine beings. And I call this infamous because it is sometimes used to justify anthropological exclusivism, so that humans have this exclusive standing in nature. Now, in the biological research, and if we take this idea of a list of life indicating functions seriously, this picture of the scala naturae must be modified. So Aristotle in his biological research emphasizes again and again that there is a gradual transition from lifeless to living and from plant to animal. So he says, in fact, nature passes continuously from inanimate things to animals by way of those things that are animate yet no animals, so that by their proximity the one seems to differ very little from the other. So what he's interested in is that plants, as it were, are mediating between lifeless and living beings. And also in this passage, Aristotle says, nature proceeds from the inanimate to the animals by such small steps that because of the continuity, we fail to see to which side the boundary and the middle between them belongs. For first after the inanimate kind of things is the plant kind, and among these one differs from another in seeming to have more share of life. So what does this mean, more share of life? Does life become a gradual concept? And I think this can be accounted for by this list of life-indicating functions. So, for example, Aristotle is always concerned about the nature of sponges. And you heard from divers that sponges are able to perceive the diver approaching. And once they perceive the diver approaching, it's harder to detach them from the cliff. So this would mean that they have a basic capacity of perception. So more share of life, according to the reading I suggested, does not mean to suggest that the transition from lifeless to life itself is gradual in a matter of degree, but that it seems to be continuous to us, because kinds of living beings differ by the numbers and types of life-defining characteristics they are able to perform. The more characteristics they display, the greater their so-called share of life. For example, sessile living beings showing signs of perception have more share of life than plants that allegedly have no perception. So I take this to be another indication that what matters for Aristotle's biological research is the fine-grained list of life-defining functions and characteristics, which, however, raises questions about the clear-cut steps suggested or insinuated by the so-called scala naturae. Finally, a very brief look into Aristotle's embryology. Aristotle's general picture of sexual reproduction is this. The male semen carrying encoded information about the species meets the female semen, which is the menstrual blood within the uterus. The female oocyte was not known by this time, and initiates a change in a portion of menstrual blood, which also carries information, namely about the mother's individual characteristics. This first change results in the formation of the heart, blood vessels that connect the heart with the uterus, and the formation of a membrane that separates the fetus from the uterus. As soon as the heart has been formed, the heart starts controlling the further development, i.e. the development is no longer steered from outside. The formation of further organs follow the logic of what is needed first to make the embryo a self-regulating system. Max Delbrück was very impressed by this picture and suggested Aristotle, therefore, for the Nobel Prize. He says, against the theory of pangenesis, the semen is not said to transmit a miniature model of the animal, but only its species-specific essence. One might even regard this as an anticipation of the discovery of the DNA. Quote, "The form principle is the information which is stored in the semen. After fertilization, it is read out in a pre-programmed way. The readout alters the matter upon which it acts, but it does not alter the stored information, which is not, properly speaking, part of the finished product." So I run out of time, but just want to read this final sentence. So according to this picture of sexual reproduction, we can pinpoint exactly what it means for a new life to come to be. As regards the nutritive soul, then, it is clear that we must posit that seeds and embryos, which are not separated, possess it potentially, though not in actuality, are not until they begin to draw the nourishment to themselves and perform the function of the nutritive soul. So once the embryo starts drawing nutrition from the uterus, this is the beginning of life, which always comes with vital heat. And here I have to stop and postpone further problems to the discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.